All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us for Left Bank Books Presents Online, bestselling author Bill Clegg, who will discuss his new book, The End of the Day, in conversation with poet and Washington University in St. Louis professor Mary Jo Bang. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore, celebrating 51 years this year. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Bill and Mary Jo, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We have adapted to the current situation and are bringing you the things that you love the most about Left Bank Books, with curbside pickup and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. We are happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Bill Clegg and Mary Jo Bang and Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you and all of your friends at left-bank.com. Look at this beautiful book. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff here through the most unusual of times. It helps us keep this event series going, so if you like these events and want to see more of them, please do support them by purchasing a copy of the book. And the bonus is that you get a fantastic book out of the deal. It's a win-win situation, and we thank you so much for your support. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from the audience at the end of the event, so please type your questions as a comment, and be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. Tonight's event. Following his acclaimed New York Times bestseller, Did You Ever Have a Family?, Bill Clegg returns with a deeply moving, emotionally resonant second novel about the complicated bonds and breaking points of friendship, the corrosive forces of secrets, the heartbeat of longing, and the redemption found in forgiveness. A retired widow in rural Connecticut wakes to an unexpected visit from her childhood best friend whom she hasn't seen in 49 years. A man arrives at a Pennsylvania hotel to introduce his estranged father to his newborn daughter and finds him collapsed on the floor of the lobby. A 67-year-old taxi driver in Kauai receives a phone call from the mainland that jars her back to a traumatic past. These seemingly disconnected lives come together as half-century-old secrets begin to surface. It is in this moment that Bill Clegg reminds us how choices to connect, to betray, to protect become our legacy. Deeply observed and beautifully written, this novel is a feat of storytelling, capturing 60 years with the framework of one fateful day. And David Evershoff says, reading The End of the Day is like studying a stained glass window up close, each piece bright and sharply cut. But when you step back and see it as a whole, you discover a large, beautiful, mysterious work of art. And Mary Beth Keane, the New York Times bestselling author of Ask Again, Yes, says, ambitious in scope, tender in detail, Bill Clegg's The End of the Day is a story that crosses boundaries of age, class, gender. Anyone who has a beating heart will find some part of themselves in this story. Bill Clegg is a literary agent in New York and the author of the best-selling memoirs Portrait of an Addict as a Young Man and 90 Days. The author of the novels Did You Ever Have a Family? And The End of the Day. He has written for New York Times, Lapham's Quarterly, New York Magazine, The Guardian, and Harper's Bazaar. And tonight, Bill will be in conversation with Mary Jo Bang. Mary Jo is the author of 8 collections of poetry, including The Bride of E, Elegy, which won the 2007 National Book Critics Circle Award. She lives here in St. Louis, Missouri, where she teaches in the writing program at Washington University. Mary Jo Bang has also translated Dante's Inferno, and her translation of Dante's Purgatorio will come out in 2021 from Gray Wolf Press, and I will provide a link for how to pre-order that from Left Bank Books as well. And now, without further ado, I would love to welcome Bill Clegg and Mary Jo Bang for Left Bank Books. If everyone would please help me in giving them a very hearty round of applause. Hello.
Hello. Hello, Shane.
Hi.
Thanks so much. Hi, Mary Jo.
Hi, Bill. Good to see you.
to see you too. First time I've seen you in a long time.
No, it's true. The pandemic. Have you heard about it?
Yeah, it's reached me. Yeah, it's reached me.
So I have some questions here. I'm not used to talking to fiction writers, but I know one time, a long time ago, I wanted to be a fiction writer. So these are come out of my my early attempts to do that. One thing that's interesting about this novel is that instead of chapters, there are sections with people's names on them. And as you begin to read, you quickly find out that that person's name is the point of view character for those pages. And then we go from one point of view character to another. Did you have that in mind before you began, or was that something that evolved?
It's something that evolved, I think, in the writing. I would when I first began Did You Ever Have a Family, which is the first novel I wrote, and it's actually the source of one of the central characters of The End of the Day. I found that process of leaping from one perspective to another, to kind of examine, various versions of a truth. One of the things that's kind of in both books is this idea of what happens in small towns and sort of the stories that get told about people in small towns. And I grew up in a very small town. In fact, one that's the not very loose model for Wells, Connecticut, which is the town in both books. People sort of have they sort of exist in certain identities in small towns. At least that's my experience. And if you asked one person simply about the owner of the liquor store, they might tell you one thing, and if you ask another person, and they would have an entirely different version of that person. And so, in writing these books you really center in and excavate the experience of living in a small town like this. I just felt like going from one perspective to the next mirrored that experience of growing up in a town like that.
It also allows new people to come on stage, because just as soon as you think, oh, okay, the story's going to be about these people, because we've begun to see some connections, suddenly in part two, there are new characters, and you think, okay, what does this mean?
Yeah.
And it turns out they are connected, and that becomes both suspenseful and fascinating. And did you know all of these characters were going to exist in the story beforehand, or did some show up?
They absolutely showed up. The only at the beginning of writing this book, as I said, Jackie, who is in her late 60s and has been born and raised children and become a widow and has retired from being a elementary school secretary in this small town. So she's very much of the town, and she lives alone in a modest house. And she appears as the mother of a minor character in Did You Ever Have a Family? And the experience of writing her in that book was, I didn't think that she was just functioning as a kind of witness to grief at that point. And she comes out of her house in her robe and leaves her porch light on, and somehow I couldn't shake her, and I became fascinated by her. And so while I was writing that book, for a little while, I thought she would become more of a prominent character in Did You Ever Have a Family? And then her childhood best friend, Dana, sort of appeared, and I just kept on writing that friendship, and it became pretty clear, like early on, that there wasn't going to be room for them. But I was still interested, so I just kept on going back to her when I would hit walls in Did You Ever Have a Family? And so there might be 9 months where I didn't open up the file that had Jackie But then when I would, it would always be with like a sort of like I somehow knew a lot more about her than I thought I knew, and I just became very interested in her. And part of it was just sort of trying to understand why I was interested in her. And so the writing of that character was almost like analysis, just kind of writing and writing and writing as you talk in analysis. You just talk and talk and talk, and then some sort of meaning is gleaned by patterns or, surprises. And so after I finished Did You Ever Have a Family, I went back to her and her childhood friend. And when I knew that there was a book there was actually something that happened, which is I had heard a story, overheard a story, really about somebody who grew up in the town next to mine, Lakeville, Connecticut. And it was I don't know what kind of picnic it was, but in my mind, it was a holiday picnic. He was with his young family, and he went to run an errand. And this was in the 1960s, and he ran into a group of kind of flashy New Yorkers who were drinking, and he fell in with them, and they invited him up to the top of this mountain where there was a cabin and a party going on. And he went, and he didn't come back down from that cabin for 3 months.
Oh my God.
And so that story caught my eye, and somehow that story and this friendship between this sort of wealthy New Yorker, Dana, and this small town girl, Jackie, which I had been writing around and around, somehow that was sort of the spark that kind of like lit the story, and the novel became very clear to me at that point. And so there were surprises after that, but in the main, like I could see the shape of what was going to unfold. So it's a long way to answer your question.
Oh, it's fascinating, but also it's fascinating to me. You said you went to the folder that was Jackie. So do you keep folders on these characters quite separately?
I kept a folder on her once it was clear she wasn't going to be in the first novel. I lifted her out of that document. I just cut and pasted her. But I didn't know what I'd find out, because I was still, while I was puzzling, Did You Ever Have a Family took a long time to write, and I was still puzzling through a lot of the kind of the family trees that made up the town, and hers like bumped up against some of those trees. So part of my writing her, there were other things that I was writing around that novel, but that were in support of writing the novel, and but hers was the one that just like kind of took on a life of its own, and so it was like my treat. Like if I had sort of shouldered a rough chapter for a number of hours, I would just jump into hers and just
Interesting.
Yeah.
Did you like being with her, or like to her life?
Yeah, it sounds kind of sad, but like I still think about her. Like there's still aspects of I think, in the end of the day, her life from childhood to her late 60s, is involved. And so even though there's this, there is this sort of sweep of a whole life that's contained in the book, there's a lot that I am still thinking about and kind of curious about. I won't write another book about her to answer those questions, but these characters take a while to shake. I'm not sure I ever fully shake them after I've been with them for so long.
It's interesting. I said I wanted to be a fiction writer in the beginning. I took a class in 1980. I lived in Evanston, and Northwestern was offering a program for women at night, 3 night classes. You could pick one. One was fiction writing. One was some aspect of history, and I don't remember what. And the other was how to understand football so that you could watch football with your husband.
No way.
Play the game. Those were the 3 options.
Can I just interject? I feel like that alone is like the stuff of a novel. Like, so maybe you should, it's not,
not too late.
You've done everything else. You might as well write a novel.
But when I took this novel writing class, the teacher said you had to know your character so well. And she talked about a friend of hers who was also a novel writer, who's had to stop writing for 6 months because she had created a scene where the woman was at a party and someone was passing the hors d'oeuvres, and she didn't know whether the character would take one or not. And so she couldn't go any further. Do you feel that you even know that if Jackie were at a party and the hors d'oeuvres were passed, whether or not she would take one?
I think if I thought about it for a second, I think I'd know the answer. I think so. But I can't imagine derailing an entire writing project for 6 months because you couldn't. I mean, there's also something so sexist in that too, like that it's like that it's an hors d'oeuvre, it's a party. It seems like such a kind of domestic situation designed for like I don't know, like there's a lot in that. But I think so. It's less that I know for a fact. It's just that I have a general sense of, I know, I have an informed answer probably to most questions that you could ask about Jackie. But I actually don't presume to know everything about her. That's partly, I think, what kept. I mean, this book took me, this book really kicked my ass, because it went wider than I initially intended, and so there was a certain amount of, and I actually there were things that I had to sort of scuttle from the book that I was very loath to do. Like the stuff that occurs in Kauai, like I populated that more originally, and ended up kind of condensing a fair bit of that into not summary, but sort of like collapsed history, as opposed to, kind of in scene, like fully lived experience in the book. It just became too long and too much. So yeah.
I was going to ask you about that because since you grew up in Connecticut, you deeply know Connecticut.
Yeah.
You lived your whole adult life in New York, so you deeply know New York. But did you have to do research to really flesh out the scenes in Hawaii?
I spent time in Kauai, and the area where she lives, is where Hanalei Bay is where I've been and stayed and spent time. It's really beautiful. It's really interesting, and but it's also a very spare landscape. It's not heavily populated, and also she works as a taxi cab driver, like sort of within the kind of the bandwidth of a world of tourism, which is essentially how I was there. I mean, I could tell you something else, but I was a tourist in Kauai. And so I did do research on like sort of the history of Kauai and the history of the Hawaiian Islands and which is, and even later, like when sort of activist movements in Hawaii kind of like really sparked up in the 70s and 80s. I mean, and since, but it's it's a story. It's a story that we know well. And so I did research into that, and then in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is sort of the other like backdrop or place where things unfold. My husband actually is from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and from the first trip that we ever took there, which was before I started writing this book, I became obsessed with that town. It's a really interesting town. It's very different from any place I'd ever been or lived, and it had this incredibly important industry, steel, and an incredibly important company, Bethlehem Steel, which really was the kind of like the main employer for the town and the area. And that company and that industry like collapsed, and by the 90s was essentially gone, and leaving this like large, complicated ecosystem without a source of income. and identity and livelihood and the way that town has kind of pivoted away from that tragedy into, I mean, the town is actually quite a thriving, vibrant town. I mean, they've done all sorts of things to save it, and so, but just hearing people talk about that history, which is very immediate for them, and the generations of people who worked at the steel mills and worked for Bethlehem Steel is interesting, because I grew up in a place where there wasn't like one industry. There was like very little businesses to begin with. And so living in a town where like, you know, most people are, you know, the center of gravity in terms of employment and identity is one employer, was totally fascinating to me. And really looking at how power works in the ecosystem of a small city like that, it was riveting. So that's where that came from.
Well, and I concede so much about this book is about power in a small sense, not the power of politicos or, you know, the titans of industry, but power over one's own life and power over those people who are in the periphery of your life. So I can imagine getting, like, having that sense reflected in a place would be very interesting and lead you to various places.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, I seem to remember either reading or perhaps you even told me that the other novel, you knew how you wanted it to end, and the entire writing of it was to make that ending happen. And as I came to the ending of this book, I wondered if you had that same sense, that you knew how you wanted things to end and that you were writing towards that.
I didn't. I knew, like, there was a quality of feeling that I wanted to achieve with one of the characters, and I didn't quite know how to get there, to be honest. And so in a sense, yes, I wrote toward that. Unlike in Did You Ever Have a Family, I had written the last passage of the book like years before I'd finished the book. Yeah, and it just sort of sat there and was kind of a North Star. And in this case, it was just I knew kind of emotionally where I wanted this one character to be, and the route to achieve that I wasn't sure of. But and with two of the other characters, I wrestled for a long time about whether, I mean, there's big themes of regret and forgiveness and the kind of the carrying of secrets for many years and sort of how that shapes lives, and misunderstandings, and I for a long time I didn't know how much would be revealed to some of the characters who had believed certain things that weren't true. And also to the extent anyone could be forgiven, to the extent that some characters could forgive themselves. And so I really sort of almost just waited to see what would happen when I got to some of those key scenes. And I even wrote them sort of around, you know, I wrote them differently at various stages. But part of that was also, I think for me, what kept the book alive and the immediacy of writing, I hope, is in the experience of reading it too, is just, you know, sort of like the sense of, you know, what's unfolding, what's going to sort of be around the corner, what will happen. And I don't mean like in any kind of like big dramatic sense, but just really unpeeling, you know, these sort of layers of sort of who these characters are and how they're going to respond in a certain set of situations. And they're all interpersonal situations. So the stakes are low, in a global sense, but very big, like in a personal sense for these characters.
Well, and there's a lot of suspense, and the suspense keeps morphing too, because you're suspenseful about this one character, and then you think, well, no, that's not going to happen. What I think is going to happen, what I'm afraid is going to happen.
Right.
And so I wanted to even ask you, since I teach in a writing program, is there something teachable about suspense, about how to maintain suspense? I tell the poets that just like fiction, you have to have suspense. You don't want to give everything away too soon, but this is really masterful in keeping these various lines of suspense going.
I mean, I think the only thing that I would advise on that, or just describe as useful to me, is not committing to, even though I wrote the last passage of the book that came before, years before I finished it, it had nothing to do with the plot. It was really like, just a passage of writing, and that resonated with, I hoped would resonate with the whole book by the time I finished it. But I think a lot of it is like not contracting too early to an idea of how things are going to unfold, or contracting too early to even like how a character is. Like, I think you have to sort of allow them to, and it sounds very woo-woo, but in a way it is like, so I think not committing too early on to how a character would be in a certain situation or aspects of their past. I think there may be something that you find yourself writing that alters like their origin story, and then like the pieces of the puzzle sort of become clearer to you. And I think that kind of sense of discovering your characters as you go, and being open to having a new experience of them as you go, like keeps, for me anyway, I think the immediacy of that, like that suspense. And so, which isn't to say that like you don't have like certain goals or certain thoughts about how things are going to go, or but I think if particularly in the generative period, in that like, as the plot is unfolding and as you're making decisions about characters, I think for as long as you possibly can, and then because at a certain point it would be madness, but for as long as you possibly can, to just to stay open to a new experience of like of not just the characters but the story that you're telling, and to interrogate it, kind of as you go. So that's because it's hard. Like when you're sitting at a computer for a long time and nobody in the world is asking for your piece of fiction to exist. It really is the only one asking for it is you. Like, I think keeping that sense of that, just that new energy that you kind of need to have, to be able to keep creating. If you know all the answers and you've made all the decisions, then it becomes carpentry after that. And so I think like the more mystery that stays in the process, the more alive the writing is, the more suspenseful, I suppose, it can be. But in terms of the mechanics of suspense, I think that is something of a task of carpentry at a certain point. Like you go back and you sort of see what's been revealed and what's not been revealed, and also plausibility, like keeping if you're choosing not to disclose something for a long time, or you're signaling that there's the possibility of some kind of revelation, it's also a matter of making whatever is revealed or whatever is not revealed plausible within the universe of logic that you've created. And so so that's also, I think, important, is just sort of keeping things anchored to a certain like good sense and an authenticity to the characters and to the world. Because if a writer doesn't believe what they're reading, they're not going to care what's going to come around the bend. So
that's true. Do you have any rituals that you talk about sitting down to write, except for making sure that you have, a decent battery in your computer these days. We don't even sharpen pencils. How do you begin? Is there any kind of ritual? Do you just click open something and start?
In the beginning, and when it's still possible to, I read from the beginning of whatever I've written before, and just start fresh, to kind of, also because my experience of writing is that I have a day job, and it may be months between the periods where I'm writing, and so that often becomes necessary for me to kind of like fully re-enter. And in fact, the first day I don't write at all. I just read, and kind of meditate, and just kind of like let the world sort of fall away a little bit. But then even like in the subsequent days, I'll try to go back and read from the beginning, just to kind of fully enter the logic that I've created, like, and the perspective that I'm working on. So that's really the only ritual. I wake up very early in the morning to write. I go to like our small place, in the Hudson Valley, away from the city, and I'm alone. There's no music. Like, it just has to be quiet, and I have to be alone. And then I'll take a break at some point, and then return work, emails and phone calls for a few hours, and then go back in. And so usually it's in these sort of intense kind of like benders of writing, where it's like either a long weekend or a week, where it's the only thing I do, and then I'll return and write until midnight, and then wake up at 5:30 in the morning and start again. But really being in the bubble of it helps me, and it's also really fun. It's like, to me, like as fun as life can get, like just to be in this fictional world where you're, sort of wrestling with ideas and language, and it's incredibly private.
Well, and the use of language, it's really, I'm fascinated the way you capture associative rumination. There was this one point where Jackie's remembering how her son used to torment the cat in order to provoke the daughter. And then that goes to another memory of the son, where now you see two aspects of the son. And suddenly this character named Floyd comes in, and Floyd turns out to be the father. And it was kind of this moment of enlightenment when I thought, I'm getting this whole family. I thought I was just having this spot on moment where something provokes this memory, but suddenly a whole family becomes in front of your eyes. And then the revelation of who Jackie is, because she's not only a member of those different family relationships and arrangements, but she's someone obsessed with this very notion of this family. And so the revelation through the rumination was fascinating to me, because you do it again and again. There's a kind of willingness to go deep and to go small, but in that smallness, there's a whole world.
But that's how that's how I experience life. I mean, in because we're never just where we are. I mean, I'm, in an apple orchard in Ellsworth, Connecticut, 5 seconds ago. Like, parts of our lives just come up unbidden, and they often just happen in a flash, or you sort of graze a memory, or even a sensation, or even an idea that you'd had. And so I feel like we're constantly in dialogue with like who we were. Particularly, I have a number of people in my life who are a fair bit older than I am, and I've known them now for 25, 30 years. And so when we first met, I was quite young, in my late teens, early 20s. And now many of these people are in their 80s, and those who are left, and so I met them in very busy moments in their lives, where they were sort of at the center of a peopled existence, and much was going on, and they were very useful, and to others, and to the worlds they occupied, and I watched as their families you know, either grew up in a way, or many friends and spouses died, and work fell away, and other aspects of life fell away. And I've watched people get stripped of their identities in so many ways. And so with Jackie, and with really all the characters in some way, I mean, especially two of them, Dana too, just when one is just left with oneself, it's like, it's, you know, especially with Jackie, who, as you say, was obsessed with the idea of a family, but was determined to have it as soon as she could, like, to establish that beachhead. And so, you know, on the other side of that, like, you know, her husband is dead, her kids have grown up, she's no longer works, and she lives in the house where all of this happened very loudly for many years. And so she still hears it. It's still there for her. And so I think that experience of a life kind of thinning of people is, you know, and if you're lucky to live a long life, that's the, you know, it's not always the consequence, but it is often. And there's few things that interest me as much lately. So,
but I think that putting that down on paper is another thing. And I think so much of natural realism in fiction is either dialogue and or action. Somebody goes from here to there, they say this, they say that, but there's not a lot of interiority. And I feel like your books mine that interiority in a way that is exceptional and unusual, and feels so absolutely true to life. Because, as you say, we are the product of all of those synaptic firings of remembering, associating, worrying. You know, that's who we are. Yeah. And that's what you do to create a character. And I think that that's the success of your books and why they stand out.
Thanks, Mary Jo. That's, and I don't, you'll also notice that I don't write a lot of dialogue. And I think of dialogue as a superpower that some writers really, really have. And, but I find, like, spoken language only part of the story. And so, like, I find writing dialogue frustrating because there's so much else I want to sort of attend to it. And then if you're attending to dialogue as much as I am tempted to, then it actually becomes interior. Like, yeah. It's sort of, but excellent dialogue that doesn't require all of that attending, like, is a miracle. And it can be just as piercing as the most precise description, you know, of an emotion or a feeling. And it's something I'm playing at right now, but when it doesn't feel natural, I won't allow it in the books. And so I often have written fair bits of dialogue that I just scrap. But I respect those who do that very well.
Well, I think that the dialogue comes in with remembered dialogue, and that is true to life too, because that's part of rumination. I said this, I should have said that. And then you hear yourself saying what you should have said. Right. So I think there is dialogue, but it's not, it's remembered dialogue, or it's theoretical dialogue.
Yeah, yeah.
I thought to ask you a question that poets often get answered, and I never hear fiction writers question about it, and that's the idea of influences. Do you feel that there were writers that you read early on who influenced you?
I think the writers who I read early on, I wouldn't say that they were the ones who influenced me, but there are writers later, like, who, I mean, one thing, I think Gene Stein's Edie influenced me a lot. This idea of excavating a truth to find that there really isn't one. And I think that her process, which was so artful, so nimble, and also so riveting and propulsive. Like, there's something so propulsive about, hearing somebody's, take on a certain moment at a dinner party, and then you hear somebody else's, and then there's just you consume that greedily, and so as a narrative trick, it's also, I think, very shrewd. But it also it speaks to something that I think I was obsessed with before I ever even pondered writing, which is just that everybody carries around their own version of events and of people, and there really isn't one empirical truth. And so Jean's book really influenced me a lot, and then later. Certainly, like Elizabeth Strout, I think is such a great writer, and her sort of interest in and kind of validating the importance of like excavating a small town and a particular area and going back there and doing it again. Obviously, others have done it, but I think as a contemporary writer doing that to a part of the world that isn't sort of celebrated in the typical ways. Like I think that also was kind of inspiring.
I see Shane is back in the picture. Hi.
Hi, Shane.
So I wanted to come back in to allow Mary Jo. I know that you have another engagement this evening, so I wanted to make sure that you had time. But you were such a fantastic interviewer that you actually asked Kathleen's question that you wanted to ask Bill. So, at almost the exact same time that she asked it. So that's so wonderful.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, well, carry on and enjoy. And it was lovely to see both of you.
Thank you, Mary.
A reminder to everyone that Mary Jo's book Purgatorio comes out next summer and is available for pre-order now.
Bye.
And it's amazing.
Bye. Yeah. I just love that you are Mary Jo's literary agent. So
I am Mary Jo's literary agent, very, very proudly. Yes. So I've read that translation, and I can vouch for its excellence. It's funny too. She's brilliant with wit and brings such new life to the text.
I just love working with Mary Jo. I love getting to do events with her. She asks such astute questions. Like I didn't even realize when reading that you don't do a lot of dialogue. It's so smooth and it's so organic that normally I don't necessarily love a lot of dialogue, but I enjoy it and I appreciate it, and I find myself gravitating a lot towards books that do have a lot of dialogue. So.
Mm-hmm. When somebody does it well, it's like mesmerizing. It's like clairvoyance. I don't know how you do it. I mean, whenever I've done it to satisfaction, it's like I'm kind of surprised in some ways. So, but it's also, there's some people who are very good on social media, very good on texting with like sort of that quick, where like even just the spare set of words can convey an enormous amount and create a kind of momentum and a propulsion on their own.
Kathleen does have another question. So Kathleen is another faculty member at WashU and is just incredible. So Kathleen is wondering if Bill happens to have another memoir in you.
I have, I don't know is the answer. I think I might. I wrote an essay for Vogue magazine this spring about becoming a parent unexpectedly, which is something that has happened 4 years ago and carries on. And I am a parent and will be a parent now for the duration, as long as one is. I think, I wasn't expecting it. It's my brother's daughter, and she's amazing, and she came into our lives quite dramatically and unexpectedly, and my husband and I have been raising her since. So we're finishing an adoption process right now, and so I hadn't written any kind of personal history or memoir in a while, and I found what I found when I wrote the first two memoirs, there's just something incredibly meaningful about putting things down. I don't know who is credited with the expression, like, I don't know what I think until I've written it down. There's an aspect of like transcribing, even, and both my memoirs were transcriptions of near experience. They were like, there weren't like many years before, they were some years before. And so I found it to be useful. And so I've been drawn back into that experience, sort of making meaning and transcribing, particularly the first year of being a parent, which was a real roller coaster. And I hadn't had time to think about much of it, just to kind of live it. It's been also amazing. So even the first two memoirs chronicle pretty dark stuff. This is not, there's darkness, but also it's one of the most extraordinary things that's ever happened. So also writing like kind of a happy memoir that involves all the complications of parenting and being married and all that. Like it's a different key, but it's I'm getting something out of it. So maybe it'll be a book. I don't know.
Yeah, and also kind of infuriatingly timely. So.
Yeah. So.
Kathleen says, "I loved that essay. Please keep another memoir open as an option." So.
Thanks, Kathleen. I appreciate it.
So my question for you, so you were you the first or the second book with this press, with Scout Press?
The first two books were at Little Brown. They both memoirs were at Little Brown, and then both novels are at Scout, at the press that I'm published by now.
But were you the inaugural book for Scout Press, or?
Apparently, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. It's an incredible press. I have read a ton of their work. I think that their editorial team is brilliant.
Yeah.
You have like Ruth Ware on your like kind of cohort team, which she's wonderful. So what was it like to kind of be a part of this brand new thing that has become so important in literary fiction and the literary world, and how do you feel like that is kind of crafting yourself as a writer, and how have they made your writing different?
They've been great. I mean, for me, because I'm a literary agent and I deal with most of the major publishers who publish serious fiction and memoir and poetry. Those people are people who I do business with. This publishing house, which is Gallery, does a lot of commercial nonfiction and very commercial fiction, and none which I don't do. And so they were all new to me. When the book got submitted, it was they were just kind of coming up with the idea of creating an imprint within that house dedicated to literary fiction. And so, and it's very small. Like, so that year, it was, I think, me and Ian Reid and Ruth Ware. And why it really works for me, apart from the fact that I think they're brilliant and they're fun and they're just an amazing team, is that like I didn't have any kind of baggage or complicating relationships like in my business as an agent, and it sort of was just kind of over here as this like sort of separate island of publishing. And so in my kind of compartmentalized life, while I'm talking to them, I'm a writer, and then while I'm talking to other editors and publisher, I'm an agent. And so it was oddly perfect for me. And it would be fine to be published someplace else where I have writers, but this was especially nice, and just kind of allowed the fault lines of my day to be like very clearly articulated.
I think they have such an artistic vision that even when the books are kind of drastically different, because your books are not very similar at all to Ruth Ware's books, but like they still fit together really well. Like, and it's a very beautiful artistic vision.
It's worked out. I'm very grateful to them. Yeah.
So the characters, you are such a master of characters, and you are able to build this entire web of people. And I'm wondering, do you have to like, are you a big plotter? Do you sketch out like who you think the characters are going to be as they are, as you're developing the book, or is it something that is developed as the book is written?
I think there's a, kind of as I said before, like it really began with the character and kind of studying and kind of peeling back the layers of who she was, Jackie, and discovering her childhood friendship with this woman named Dana, and the landscape of the road that they grew up on and the isolation of that. And out from that kind of character study sort of hatched this story. But it was a completely separate story, as I said, that I had overheard that kind of, activated a narrative that involved kind of all of them. And so it's, for me, I think character, and particularly with The End of the Day, this woman, Jackie, and sort of my curiosity about her really was the doorway in. And then, inevitably for me, I end up coming back to a lot of the same themes of class tension and identity and the experience of living in a small town, the kind of the ecosystem of power that exists within a community, and how that plays out for people over the course of, in this case, like, a lifetime.
Yeah. So if anyone else in the audience has any questions, be sure to ask those in the comments. I'm trying to think of another question because I had so many, but Mary Jo is such a great question asker, interviewer, that she asked almost all the questions that I wanted to ask that I was super curious about. I can continue the praise of, I loved Did You Ever Have a Family? I think that it is just incredible. The End of the Day, I am about halfway done. I apologize that I did not get around to reading it all before the event, but it's so beautiful and it is so well crafted that I cannot wait. Mary Jo and I were talking before the event, and she led me to really be excited for the ending. She said that it is incredible and she didn't want to like spoil anything for me, but she was effusive with her praise for the end.
I hope it lives up to that for you.
It will, I guarantee. I am a very easy to please, but I appreciate really wonderful fiction, and I think that you are incredible. So
thank you. I appreciate that.
Barbara is asking, what is your favorite genre to read?
I think, most of my personal reading, I read poetry more than I do fiction. Part of it is that just my job is it requires that I'm always reading something, and so I don't actually have a lot of time outside of the reading I do for work to read. Audiobooks have addressed this a little bit, which sounds like cheating, but sometimes it's also the only way that I can partake in a conversation around a book that's publishing right now. But I also, I represent Mary Jo. I love her writing, and so I work with writers whose writing I would read for pleasure, and so part of that is just so the choices that I make as an agent sort of make up my main reading. But poetry is what I read the most of. If you bring in my work reading, it's, I would say, literary fiction. I love memoir, so yeah, I love great memoir. I still think it's one of the most incredible forms, and it satisfies my curiosity about people, because usually, there was somebody pumping gas at the gas station today, and I was just trying to piece together what is this life? This car doesn't match this person and those shoes and that face that I could see above the mask. seemed so distraught. And it was just, I was puzzling through all of it, trying to figure it out. And so memoir is kind of like answering those questions that are not answerable, like in day-to-day interaction.
And you did the narration for the audiobook.
I'm so sorry. Yes, I did. I should, I don't know why. This one was particularly tough because I was supposed to do it in a studio in New York, and the pandemic hit, and we were suddenly upstate in the Hudson Valley where our house is, and the audio company found an old barn that had been fitted to be a recording studio, and Shawn Mendes had just finished recording in this place. It's not a very likely place. It's a country road. There's nothing there, and then I turned up to read my audiobook, and but I would drive down there and do like an hour a day because we have a kid at home and there's a company to run from the house, and so it normally, like when I've done them before, it's like you're in the studio for 6 or 7 hours. The producers are there, and you're kind of like a little bit in it. I did my best. I hope it's okay, but yes, I did. I read the audio. So I apologize to the audio company. It sounds like I'm not doing a good job selling that audiobook, but like I have to be honest about it.
Subtle plug for Libro.fm, which is the independent bookstore source for digital audiobooks. It's a great company, and that's actually where I got the audiobook. So.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah. And I think it's great. So.
Oh, good. Oh, so you're listening to it. So you can. Yeah. Does it make sense? Because at a certain point, I just feel like it's just words coming out of my mouth, words that I'm very familiar with, and so I just think, wow, if anybody's listening to this, I hope they can understand or keep like track of the story.
I think like I consider literary fiction to. Like I put nonfiction like double speed, not double speed, but like 1.25 or whatever speed, because I can lose track of myself a lot faster with nonfiction, and if I miss something, I mean, yeah, the writing is still fantastic. Obviously, I appreciate that, but with literary fiction, I feel like if you miss something, like you kind of have to go back, and you kind of have to really be paying attention. And so I am paying attention a lot, and yeah, I'm about halfway done, and I'm not commuting, so therefore, that's my time to listen to a lot of audiobooks. So now I'm just doing the dishes unnecessarily a lot, so it's fine.
Right. I recommend Elizabeth Gilbert's audiobook of City of Girls, read by Blair Brown. It's so good. The book is genius, but the recording by Blair Brown is genius. It's so engrossing, and it's humbles anybody who ever tries to read an audiobook like I did. But yeah, it's a brilliant book.
The one that blew me away most recently was The Death of Vivek Oji.
Oh, I haven't read it.
Kwesi. I do not remember how to pronounce their last name. Non-binary author, actually kind of made the news, not like this week, actually, for one of the awards, the Women's Prize for Fiction.
Yeah. Oh, I see. There's a controversy about whether or not they're allowed. Yeah.
Exactly. So that book is incredible, and is it's one of the reasons why I've sobbed during the pandemic. It's just so.
Oh, I'll check it out. That's a good recommendation. Thanks.
Another question for we'll do another quick question. I'm trying to read Kathleen's other question. I'll read Barbara's and let you answer that. So, were you a reader as a child? Was reading important in your home when growing up?
It's all we had. We had the outside, and we had books because we didn't really have TV. We had like fuzzy channels, but for me, yeah, books were everything. Also, I grew up in this small town in Connecticut that wasn't suburban. It was very rural, and our house was 20 minutes from the center of a town that didn't even have a stoplight. So we were really, it was very remote, and so part of the way I found out about the world at all was just reading. And so, and I read everything. I remember reading, you know, Sophie's Choice, but I also read like, I remember reading like Hollywood Wives, like by Jackie, what's her name? Jackie, very pulpy writer.
Jackie Collins?
Jackie Collins, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Of that actress. But in the main, I read, as a kid, especially, like all these big, sprawling, like kind of allegorical tales by C.S. Lewis and Lloyd Alexander and Susan Cooper and Madeleine L'Engle, and I mean, I just consumed those books like crazy, and so books were oxygen. Books were like, you know, I didn't have the happiest like childhood. It wasn't, I mean, in many ways it was like very nice, but there was a lot of, you know, I grew up in an alcoholic household, and anybody who was grown up in one knows what that's like. And books were the place I went to make that possible. So I always say that books were my first like drug of choice. And so yeah, books were and are kind of everything. Thank God for them.
So Kathleen had to run away, but recommends or asks, have you ever read A Mother in History by Jean Stafford about visiting Lee Harvey Oswald's mother for 3 days not long after the assassination?
No, I know about that and I haven't read it, but that's a great suggestion. I think maybe I'll just go track that down after this, because it's been referred to before, and it's so interesting, like as a scenario. So yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much. I'm a big fan, in case you didn't notice. And thank you for your work, getting beautiful words into the bookstores around the world, especially Left Bank Books. Yeah, I'm very happy to finally be doing an event with you. So
thanks, Shane. I really appreciate it. I appreciate all the care you put into this. Thank you.
And as a reminder to the audience, the book is available at left-bank.com. We have copies available now. You can order to have them shipped anywhere in the country. You can pick them up. You can have them shipped to you, whatever's most convenient for you. And I want to thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And we hope to see you again really soon. Have a good night, everyone.
Take care. Thank you.